What? Oh, thank you. So before I begin my talk, just want to thank the organizers for having me alongside all the amazing talks I've seen here today so far. So a little bit about me. I'm Rushaine. I'm a software engineer here in New York. I write a lot of JavaScript and Ruby code. These days I'm doing it at Kickstarter, a crowdfunding platform that brings creative projects to life. Also help run Manhattan.js here, a local monthly meetup, focus on things front end. It's once a month. You guys should check us out, along with our family of friends and meetups. Also, these happen different points in time in Brooklyn, Queens, and Jersey Script. And if you'd like to stay in touch, my Twitter handle is CopaceticKid on Twitter and Instagram. So today I'm going to be talking to you about testing. And I write a bunch of JavaScript and Ruby code using different tools and frameworks specific to a project's needs. These are both very active communities, but in the JavaScript community, there's been more of a churn in the past few years with what's the right framework and tool to use, but not a lot of focusing on testing as if you were in the Ruby community. They very much pride themselves on that, no matter what the tool they're suggesting you to use. So even though the JavaScript community is great for coming up with great frameworks like Angular, Ember, or React, they're still lacking that need of thinking about testing in the same way we do with frameworks. So it's easy to find yourself thinking about testing, that it's too hard, it's not worth doing, so you just end up not doing it at all. And that's a choice you're making for your code because you're not seeing the value. It's not worth it to you because of like the time and the money. So testing has to be worth it. There's a lot of cost to testing, whether it's the tools, you learning how to test, knowing what to test. So clearly you want to make sure that you're testing your app and it will be worth it. But what does worth it mean? The real question here is, what is going to be your motivation? And that answer is courage. So with test-driven development, you get that. And you don't necessarily have to adopt all the parts like people are saying. You can adopt the parts that work for you. No matter how mature your app is, it's never really too late to start bringing in testing. So you don't end up like this guy, where you're just debugging code you or someone else may have written in the moment of that. So you don't want to always just like test or over-test your UI. Things end up too brittle. There's too many moving parts. Over time, things are just slow and they're hard to write. And you don't know really how to isolate that problem. So today I'll be focusing on testing your code and how to decide what you're going to be testing and how that decision overall shapes the design and the architecture of your application. Testing provides you and your engineers the courage to tackle all sizes of programming problems and know how they work. So when adopting TDD, on a broad level, most people just do no tests, mostly at the UI, or a split between unit and integration tests. But why is this worth doing it? Really, it's the time. Time is a limited resource, but a good metric to measure so you know that it's worth it. Ideally, in the future, you'd be saving yourself and other engineers the time of building new features. Because tests cost time, but they save time. When you're writing them, they take time in the short term, but the long-term benefits arrive. Here are some of like the pros and cons. But the pros are on your left, and the cons are on your right. And increasingly, you just want to focus more on the pros, so you increase that time and you get to onboard engineers faster. You have more courage in what you wrote or someone else wrote, and therefore, in the long term, you'll be seeing that value. So when you're weighing like this cost and the value, those happens at different point in the life cycle of testing. So you'll want to start to think about what you want to be testing, but really there's like no right answer. That really depends on the exact needs of your app. Everything is based on the context of what you're doing for your company. Everyone's costs and benefits play out differently. But what you're aiming to do is come up with a strategy for what you'll be testing so you can provide that. And usually you'll see this value add, again, like I said, with onboarding new engineers, someone's picking up a new part of the code base they haven't worked on before, so they'll be able to ramp up quickly. So when it comes to writing these tests, don't just think about the UI test and running like, say, Selenium or something. Those are valuable, but you also want to approach thinking about testing in a food diagram way, making sure you have different parts. So at the bottom, you'll want to be having your unit tests at the most, going with your integration, end to end, and that varies for teams depending on your size of QA engineers or not, how much of that you'll have. And then manual testing, especially for stakeholders who are not on your technical team, maybe that's the best way they can get in there to test a feature. And writing more tests at the lower level have their benefits, just because they'll run faster, they're easier to write, and it's a shorter feedback loop for the engineer in the moment to see that something is working. And then this will lead to that modular design of isolating and identifying problems in your code base. So you'll write more unit tests. You'll take smaller steps and dividing and conquer what you're trying to implement there by making a function smaller and smaller as you break it down. Write a little bit, spike it to learn even sometimes, even just filling out the tests before you've actually written the code to see that I'm going down the right path. And writing tests before creating a piece of code, writing tests takes time. Like, you'll get better at that over time. It's a skill you will develop. At first, it will be hard. Like, if there are local meetups or people in your company who are good at that, like, pair and practice with them. It's just an effort you have to build up. Like, when you're learning to code, you're just now learning how to test that code. And like anything in life, practice and time will make you master it. And good tests will shape the code, making it more modular, cohesive, and loosely coupling. And you can think about this by applying the 3 A's pattern. You'll want to arrange your code. That's like any pre-setup for you to actually act on it and actually execute a function, and then assert and check that the expected outcome is what you wanted. So where do you start? This again varies, but you want to start small. You don't want to just like say we're going to test everything. Start by finding a bug that might be occurring in production, and there might be no test around that. Like, write a test around that, show your team, and that's a small win to showing like, okay, now we've figured out, we've debugged this issue by testing it and showing them the value in your organization of testing. These incremental changes can lead to that cultural shift you want so that you're just now testing during development and not after the fact. So again, you'll want to like test behavior and drive that with having positive, negative, and expectation tests. A good way to incrementally develop code is through this series of a cycle and test for that positive outcome, the negative, and any like exceptions or errors you think might arise, especially if you're using like a third-party tool that you're integrating with. And get more non-technical people in this process too, whether it's during your planning, if you don't have a PM, but you're dealing directly with stakeholders who are non-technical in your organization. You want to get everyone aligned on the expected behavior so that any engineer who picks up this task can just go and build it and don't have to wonder about the what-ifs of what might come next. So you'll want to balance time spent on these tests. You can do this by following the pyramid guide. The short-term cost isn't really related to like the time you're spending writing that. And you should only really think about writing integration tests as they appear for the future at hand and like just adding on to them. You don't necessarily need to spin up a new integration test for every new feature. And your unit tests will survive this benefit of like having those little pieces so they integrate. So usually you're just either tinkering or changing integrations as tests as new features come along. So you'll want to avoid slow tests, and then by doing this, you don't want to, if you're seeing yourself copying, pasting a lot of setup, that's something you should start to decouple. Don't have a lot of unrelated assertions to something you're testing at hand. And logic that's too far away from a test is a code smell in a way of like having to trace level back up 2 or 3 paces too high. And think about what will make a test fail. Like, is it going to fail uniquely? And if not, maybe that just doesn't need to be there. And minimize like the amount of objects and things you're setting up, and focus more on like the complexity of breaking down the problem at hand. So write more integration tests to save during development time. This would be during the happy path. tests have costs. Initially, those are just writing, running, and fixing them, but they also have value in the long term to capture bugs, help with code design, validates code, and automates your testing suite so you're not doing anything manual. Thank you.